Good morning, my name is Jessica Benseman from the New Zealand Ministry for Environment, and I'm here to share some reflections from New Zealand's experience in designing an agricultural emissions pricing system. Agricultural emissions make up around half of New Zealand's total greenhouse gases, and we have legislated split gas targets to try and reduce both short and long-lived gases from agriculture. In our climate change legislation, there was provisions for agriculture to enter the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, which currently captures all other sectors of the economy, unless an alternative pricing system could be designed. So from 2019, the government worked with agriculture sector partners to try and design what an alternative pricing system could look like for agriculture. There were some principles that set up the pathway from the beginning that had an impact on the final design of the pricing system and some of the trade-offs that needed to be made along the way. In the end, at the conclusion of this process, the design was for a farm level split gas levy that would have different prices for different gases, and the funding would be collected to recycle back to the sector to try and incentivise emissions reductions and pay for sequestration happening on farm. The funding would also be used to contribute towards R&D for mitigation technologies and research and the costs of the system. We had a change of government in late 2023 and are currently awaiting further policy direction in this space. Reflections from the process include the importance of having a really clear target and agreed pathway for emissions reductions as much as possible from the beginning to set the frame for how the pricing system could work. And this includes having conversations early on with the agriculture sector and the broader public about what the emissions pricing system is trying to achieve and how that relates to fairness and equity with how emissions are priced in other parts of the economy, as well as other environmental objectives that may be trying to achieve, maybe attempted to achieve across the farming sector, such as around water or biodiversity outcomes. There's another secondary consideration is a conversation around what pathways are acceptable or not acceptable to reduce emissions, because there are a number of ways that emissions on farm can be reduced, and these will have varying social and economic consequences. So from the spectrum of just requiring mitigation technology or some on-farm practice change to achieve reductions through to other pathways such as land use change, reduced production or business closures, which obviously have a greater impact on social and economic outcomes. There's also a need to ensure that those principles are clear up front, but there's also an awareness of some of the trade-offs between those principles and the practicalities of operationalizing and implementing the pricing system. So in New Zealand, there was a strong preference to have a farm level pricing system so that farmers could be rewarded at source for any emissions reductions achieved. However, that obviously brings a requirement to have a much higher number of participants and therefore a greater cost to the system. There was also a preference to price at the margin with a higher price for any emissions reductions or increases. However, there were challenges around the complexity of that and the trade-offs that may be experienced between agriculture sectors in terms of the relative profitability or emissions intensity of various sectors. Once the design was agreed to be at farm level, there are further questions around what the thresholds for inclusion would be in terms of the scope of emissions and size of businesses, and then the level of detail for data required, whether or not sequestration would be included in the system, and how that could be lined up with alternative reporting requirements for farmers already. Once that had all been worked through, the system provides a greater information about the actual cost of delivering on the pricing system design, and at that point there is a need from a policy perspective to weigh up the cost and complexity of the system relative to the potential overall emissions reductions achieved. And that comes with then a review of the system to ensure that it is fit for purpose for the policy objectives. That was a really high-level summary of some of our experiences, and I'm willing to have further conversations. If you would like to get in touch, there is my email to talk through some of the challenges and opportunities we experienced in more detail. Thank you very much.
She can't see that you're clapping, but I'll tell her after you did that. So I think, in the context of this conversation, as I said, it's a fairly new initiative and also a new conversation in the EU. I think it's helpful to see this policy initiative already underway in other regions like New Zealand. But to bring it back to the EU, I actually want to start with the panelists in this room. First with Hinza, actually. I have a pretty basic question for you, actually, but given that Bayer is also involved in many initiatives to help farmers also reduce their ecological footprint, do you think that the EU is actually equipped to integrate agriculture in any ETS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe first a little bit about the company that I'm working for. So Bayer is a German company. It produces pharmaceuticals, consumer health products, and products for farmers. And I'm working for the agricultural division, so that's farmers' products. And that's seeds, that's pesticides, digital solutions, and we also support farmers in switching to more regenerative ag practices, including project development in the area of carbon farming. So that's more or less what we do. So in answer of the question, we don't have a position yet on an Agri-ETS. We're also exploring. We've seen the work of the Commission. They issued a very interesting report, I think also a very good report, and they're now starting a whole conversation in the EU to discuss an Agri-ETS system. And we really like this approach, and it really looks like the approach that was used for the carbon removal certification framework, which is of course still continuing, which is very open with a lot of stakeholder access and more or less experimenting and building. And I guess what is interesting there is that it's a process that in the end leads to a compliant system, also for agriculture, when it comes to voluntary markets, and an Agri-ETS then would be that compliant system. So is that possible within the EU? Well, farming obviously is a challenging sector, I would say, from an ETS perspective. You have a lot of small players. Farmers are also very different from each other. So each farm you could see is different. It works with nature, so it's very unpredictable. And farmers do not produce into one value chain. As you look at the proposals of the Commission, they are maybe using ETS obligation partners. They think of upstream players, but also downstream players, which can make that more complex. If we look at farming in the EU, however, it has been heavily regulated. So there is regulation on nutrient use, on pesticide use. There is regulation for the CAP, the handout of subsidies. So there is experience with regulation. What we do see, however, in the EU is that it's very action-based still. So we reward a certain practice, or we want a certain practice to be done by farmers. And when you talk about ETS, climate performance, then you should move to an outcome-based system. What the Commission is doing in the climate regulatory framework for agriculture, with, for instance, the carbon removal certification framework, that is, of course, a move, a transition to a more outcome-based system. But we are not yet there. And it's very clear that when we want a successful ETS, you need to be able, of course, to measure it, to report, to monitor, to verify cost effectively, also to make that happen. So, concluding, I think we can definitely move in agriculture to an Ag-ETS. Should we? I don't know. There are other possibilities to reach climate targets in the EU as well, other policy possibilities. But it could be done in the EU, considering the fact that we have a lot of regulation in place. There's regulation under development that we can build on, but it will take some time. But let's use the time that there is in a voluntary space to experiment, and then, yeah, that might be feasible. I hope that gives some food for thought.
Thanks, Hinze. I think absolutely. And the fact that you said it's a challenging sector to regulate in, I think we see that very visibly. If you're in Brussels, the last few months have been very full of a cacophony of sounds from tractors and protests, so you may have seen that, but it is definitely a very difficult sector to regulate. But you also mentioned that there's a lot of players that are involved, so I wanted to actually turn to, maybe the other actors in this conversation, so standards and of course project developers. But to move to the standard perspective, Gulnara, a question for you as well. I mean, you're also drawing from your experience of developing or certifying also these projects in various areas, also in West Africa and India as well. How do you see the collaboration between governments and actually the projects that you're trying to certify?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gulnar Aguiar, and I'm the CEO and founder of Ormex. My background is in capital markets, where I worked on risk hedging models in commodities trading, digitalization, and automation of trading systems. Ormex is an international standard and registry based in Paris, in France, and exclusively focused on regenerative agriculture. We have created a new methodology, which is called regenerative ecosystemic agriculture, and we have approved this methodology, which actually looks and structures projects not only from carbon perspective, but also from its co-benefits perspective on environment, on biodiversity, and social co-benefits. These to achieve high integrity and high quality carbon credits for the international markets. We certify projects, we issue credits, we transfer those on our digital platform on public and first ever public blockchain registry. We also separate removals from reductions, as we think this is an important transparency and detailed approach to actually achieve and help corporates to achieve and offset their unabatable emissions within their scopes 1, 2, and 3. Today, Ormex is operating in Africa, in India, and North America. And we are currently certifying 2 ambitious projects within a country in West Africa. And there will be a special announcement in the days to come about these projects and tremendous accomplishments of these countries and also about carbon credits ready for commercialization in agricultural sector. So the projects concern field crops like maize, cotton, and soja, as well as orchard trees and nut trees. It is a huge project done at national scale, and which also shows that it is possible to operate agricultural projects at national scale. It represents more than 2 million hectares. It's huge. We also work in India, where we are observing a different approach, where the government is courageous enough to ask big corporates to invest to invest 2% basically of their EBITDA in ESG, and to support sustainable sector including agriculture, it's really courageous to say 2% of your EBITDA is going to your ESG values. And I think that's a huge example that we should take care of and note for our EU development. And this actually permits to finance and also support the projects, agricultural projects at scale and at national scale in India.
Thank you for that, Gulnara. I think it's interesting for sure to see the standard perspective of this conversation, but also to move now to the project developing and the carbon financing side of this conversation as well. Nick, I know you've also been helping with, or Task has been assisting in the development of soil carbon credits in South Africa, and I know in South Africa there's a carbon tax. And from your perspective, do you think that has worked? What has worked well, and what have the challenges been actually navigating the system?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick, one of the co-founders of Task. We're a project developer located in sunny Cape Town, South Africa. And we latterly, we got into the sort of agricultural sector later in our company's development, but we now have projects across Australia and South Africa. And they both reflect, I think, the mechanisms that were put in place by those two governments. So in the context of today's discussion, really what I can offer you is a case study of how carbon finance can be used to incentivize change within the sector. And I think the general lessons you can learn from that are applicable in any jurisdiction that you choose to. So, however, I do have a kind of long history in working in the EU ETS and seeing how carbon finance can drive change in other sectors. So it's not necessarily a case in my mind of setting up a bespoke agricultural ETS necessarily. It's really, for me, it's about how general climate finance can be used in the agricultural sector to incentivize change. So very quickly, what you've got in South Africa, as you rightly say, there's a carbon tax that was instigated by the government. So it's not targeting the agricultural sector, it's general. So companies have to pay a tax on their CO2 emissions, and they are able to, in effect, offset 10% of that tax by purchasing carbon credits from South Africa-based projects. And in that context, the South African government has approved standards under that mechanism to encourage project development to take place. And we got involved in that quite early, and we've used the Vera VM42 methodology in that context, and so far we're the only project that's been registered under that methodology. And it's extremely complex, but in effect what it is, there's two elements to our project. One is a communal farming aspect, which is based on improved herding, which encourages the beautiful Drakensberg Mountains landscape to regenerate and generates sequestration of soil carbon. But like I said, there's no targeted approach to the agricultural sector there. It's what methodologies work in a South African context. And so you have a range of sectors involved, and of course it's where you can get your best return on investment when it comes to carbon finance. But we're extending that project now into the commercial sector to work with commercial farmers, again on sequestration in soil carbon. So that's South Africa, and I think it's important to sort of mention that these initiatives would never have happened without the carbon tax in place. So it's quite a bold move for a country like South Africa to implement that type of system, but it's worked extremely well. At least as far as we can see, the companies engage, and it's generating a lot of activity in various sectors across the country. Agriculture obviously being an important one. Another slightly different case study is in Australia. Again, it's not a targeted approach on agricultural emissions, but instead of the South African approach where they've taken existing methodologies, in Australia they've developed bespoke methodologies, and a lot of those methodologies are agricultural based. So there's a very strong emphasis in the Australian Emissions Reduction Fund on agricultural emissions. And you have a whole range of activities that take place under that fund, bearing in mind that it's not an ETS per se, it is a fund. So it's money that the government puts up that you can essentially, as a project developer, via a carbon credit, apply for certain projects. And so we, as an organization, are doing what they call environmental planting systems, which is working with farmers to, in effect, plant trees in amongst pasture land or in amongst other agricultural land to increase sequestration of carbon, not just in the soil, but also above ground carbon. But there's also more sort of VM42 type projects and methodologies where you are encouraging activity in more, arable sector to encourage change via, certain activities that encourage, again, soil carbon accumulation. So those two initiatives are very different in the way that they've been implemented, but they have a very strong effect on the agricultural sector to incentivize that type of change. And I think what's important is the availability of methodologies. And it's great that there's new standards that are coming along with new types of methodologies. All the same issues that we know around voluntary carbon markets, around delays, bottlenecks, they all exist, of course, in compliance markets as well. And in some ways they're amplified because the deadlines are pretty final. That's why there should be a strong emphasis on encouraging new standards, on encouraging new methodologies. And so I can't say much about Europe, but it of course would be of immense importance that there are very specific methodologies for the European agricultural sector, because that is what has been seen in Australia that's been very successful in their mechanism is the bespoke methodologies that they've put together. So that's probably it.
Thanks, Nick, for that. I think it's also really interesting that you say that, one, first of all, it was quite a bold move in the South Africa case study, as you mentioned, that to implement such a carbon tax, but if it had not been for that policy initiative, the initiatives that you were talking about wouldn't have actually been in place. So it was kind of the driving force behind that, which I think is something we should definitely apply in the EU context as well. But I do want to open the floor now to some questions from the audience, because we have some time. But before I do that, do you have any of the panelists have any remarks or comments on what they've heard from the other panelists? Go ahead.
I would also like to share some experience with this country where we're working in West Africa. So they have created a national authority for carbon credits, which was really helpful to actually manage risk for carbon projects and for double counting. And actually, I think that's a really good idea for EU to take an example from this and to have national authorities, because on one way it's very easy for them to approve projects and then to connect to a global system where these can be reported. And I really just congratulate these efforts. Also, I think there are lots of debates today, should we include agriculture or not in EU ETS as a carbon removal solution? Well, my position coming from capital markets, and I think we should take some examples from existing capital markets. Commodities trading and agricultural commodities trading is one of the most prosperous businesses that we can see in trading as of today. We have learned how to manage risk there, how to manage counterparty risk, market risk, liquidity risk. And definitely agriculture, according to me, must be part of carbon removal in EU ETS, because it can not only reduce its emissions, but also remove up to 3.5 gigatons of CO2 emissions annually, according to IPCC AR6. It's huge for the liquidity of the markets. It's also huge for how do we manage co-benefits, how do we manage our biodiversity in Europe, and also social well-being. Simone talked this morning about value sharing and benefits and revenue sharing. This is a great sector to get more revenue for our farmers. They need it. So yes, that's my point.
Well, thank you, Gunnar, for that. Maybe Hinze or Nick, anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean the examples that Nick gave, that very clearly shows that there are other instruments than an Agri-ETS. With regard to the removals, what we see now in the proposals of not the proposals of the Commission, it's a study that has been done, how to include removals in an ETS system, within a value chain relation, for instance, can the value chain player then use those removals? Those are important questions, and what we see in the discussion, for instance, is who should get access to agricultural removals? Should it go outside of the value chain or not? That's a whole debate. And we definitely see in the political debate that there are certain actors that say, keep it in the value chain. But even on the use of removals, if we now see, for instance, discussions in the European Parliament, but also in the European Council, with regard to green claims, very interesting what is happening there. Can we actually use removals to offset emissions? Should it only be residual emissions, and what then is a residual emission? That's what discussions are going on, and that's of course really important for an Agri-ETS. And maybe to also in reaction on Gulnara, but yeah, Nick, you also mentioned it. When it comes to an Agri-ETS, I guess one of the most, that's also a very political contentious discussion. What does agriculture need to deliver? Is that only climate mitigation, or is that also other sustainability objectives, social, environmental, economic, like for instance water and biodiversity, which has been mentioned? You have to somehow include that in your ETS design, because if you only focus on climate, you might lose sight on those other objectives. So that may be as an addition.
Yeah, okay, just a very quick point on removals and mitigation. So I think it's really important that those two aspects are accounted for separately, because of course they bring with them different risk profiles. And I think most of the controversy around agricultural emissions are usually around removals rather than mitigation. And there's a lot of mitigation that can actually be done in the agricultural sector that is pretty bona fide and fixed in science. But the removal side is, and particularly on the permanence aspect of removals, is a really important one in terms of risk management. So, there are, of course, approaches to how that's done, and they've been trialed in other sectors, such as RED, for example. But it for sure, buffer pools, all these kinds of things. There's a lot that we have to do in South Africa, for example, around fire management, which is an absolutely crucial element of any sort of natural project in that country. And so I think that's something that certainly needs to be considered in great detail. I'll be honest, of course, South Africa, they haven't themselves considered those aspects, I would suggest. They've left it to the standards to consider, and whether you think the approach taken by Vera is the right one or not, that's a matter for debate. In Australia, they themselves have for sure dealt with those issues and appropriately as they consider in their own sovereign way. But it's something that you can't escape from, obviously, in this context.
I think it's a very valid point as well, that removals is a very controversial issue when it comes to agriculture. I mean, as Hinze had also mentioned, there's the carbon removal certification framework, which has just been adopted last week by the Parliament. And this is, there was a debate ongoing from day one, land-based removals versus permanent removals, and how do we actually differentiate the quality criteria for these. And now we have the deal for this, and we have the Green Claims Directive, which is now regulating on the uses. So how do we actually differentiate between the uses of land-based versus industrial solutions? So I think it's a very difficult but important thing to keep in mind here. So with that, I will open the room to questions. We have some time for this. I think we have someone coming with a mic, but maybe the first row first.
Hi, thanks for the session. I'm Emanuela Barbiroglio from Carbon Pulse. I'm a journalist. So I have a question about ETS for agriculture in Europe. Do you think that we will see that with ETS free, and when can we expect like discussions to get serious about that? Also, do you think that the EU can take any inspiration from these examples that you just made of South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, etc.? Thanks. It's a, yeah, whoever can answer, I guess.
Maybe Hinze, perhaps you.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the Commission was very clear about the development of an ETS if there would be an ETS. So what they did in their communication on sustainable carbon cycles of 2021, interesting communication if you like to read communications, they said, look, we are going to develop a voluntary carbon market. We're building a carbon removal certification framework, and we use this to gain experience. Also in agriculture, because it was about carbon farming and of course also permanent removals. And the carbon farming part right now is not only removals, it's also emission reductions, soil emission reductions though. It's not about animal husbandry, that sort of stuff. They use this to gain experience, and then they said, well, let's say around 2030, 2031, we will examine, and then we will see if we can move to, for instance, a compliance system. And also the whole work they're doing on the Agri-ETS right now, it's really exploring, discussing. This year there will be workshops with stakeholders to discuss, okay, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, where can we move to. So that's more the trajectory. So it's not yet clear where it will go, but there are interesting options on the table, like make a fertilizer producer responsible, or make a meat processor or another value chain player downstream responsible, and then they have to work with the farmers to, well, emission reduction, mostly, but also the possibility to insert carbon removals into this Ag-ETS.
I think also just to add on one point, the only thing is that the Commission has done so far is fund this first study, a very initial exploratory study. This was in July of last year. But they did announce earlier this week at the expert group, the carbon removals group, that there will be a second study coming now. So there's still a few milestones to reach before we have a legislative proposal. We don't know when it will be in terms of timeline, but there is movement. I think it's important also to keep momentum up with this topic. It's specifically on the Agri-ETS, yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot for the panel so far. This is probably a question to Nick and maybe a little bit to Gulnara. I'm founder from Green Trade. We're in the field of forward financing of nature and tech-based projects, and we also have soil carbon projects in our portfolio, work with the likes of Greener, and we do find it relatively challenging to attract investors into the field, given, and you mentioned, there's a lack of certification bodies, there's lack of legacy projects, there's only one, I've just found out this morning, with your one project actually is listed on according to VM42. The question is rather, when you speak to buyers, what are your arguments to invest today into these type of projects, given the challenges in the market? And maybe this is a side question to you, because I think you have mentioned it. Maybe apart from the carbon stream in the future, maybe the commodities that are generated through these products, because let's say cashew nuts or soya beans as a byproduct to attract investors. Maybe this is a field. I'm just opening here a discussion, but I'm just trying to find good pathways. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent question. It's all about incentivization, right? So investors will get involved in a project if they feel the incentives are right. Buyers will get involved in a project if they think the incentives are right. Farmers will get involved. You know the story. So investors, if you're into project-based investments, you want to know that there's a forward stream of reliable credits that you can sell to a buyer who's going to be there for the next 5 or 6 years. So in South Africa, it's there, right? You've got a carbon tax. You know these guys are locked in on a forward stream of demand that you can basically address with your project. So that is the incentive, right? I mean, it's not surprising that we've done this project in South Africa. We wouldn't have done it anywhere else because of that incentive. So it's utterly crucial, and that gives us the ability to go to investors and say, well, this is the mechanism, this is how it works. We can go to buyers and exactly the same story. And that's carbon finance, right? That's this is the story that we've been telling investors in lots of other sectors for many, many years. And it's only now that agriculture is coming into that framework. So it's all about the incentives for me.
Isn't it the question of insetting? Like when you speak to food and bev companies, you can argue, well, on the one side, you invest into this project within your own supply chain, you reduce your emissions, and B, you can use insets against your own emission targets, and in theory, even sell those credits.
Yeah, so there's no inset. So for us, it's not an insetting game at all. Our investors are not agricultural. They deal with agricultural commodities, but they're not per se an agricultural investment vehicle. They are a carbon market investment vehicle, and that's what's and that's what's crucial, because it's the mechanism in South Africa, also Australia, that has brought mainstream finance into carbon removal in agriculture. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what we're trying to achieve with this, right? And I think these case studies have proven that it works. Of course, there's a lot of, you're feeling the pain, and I feel your pain with developing these projects. It's not easy. It's a long-term, you need patient capital, right, to make them work. But I think as long as the incentives are there over the long term and they're visible and transparent, what you're left with as a developer really is political risk. But the way the voluntary carbon market is, you'd probably rather take the political risk over, some arbitrary voluntary carbon market risk, because that's how we see it. We come from a compliance market background, so that's for us where we feel the most comfortable in addressing risk, basically.
Thank you for your question. I think it's from standard perspective, effectively, what we see, especially in Europe, is that there are several standards and methodologies operating at regional level, at national level, at EU level. Some of them are ISO, some of them, but what is important for their big buyers, what we see is that all these standards are compliant with international requirements of what is high integrity, what is high quality looks like, what are CCP requirements. And if these are not integrated, if there is no additionality, if there is no permanency of the project and how it is managed and how it is monitored, if it is not clear, the buyers will not come. So this is one of the arguments that we see, and that's why we're positioning ourselves on international markets and compliant with ICVCM, with ICROA requirements, and some others. The second point is, and I forgot the second point, but the second point is also about I think, the risk management, and also what is the level of this project, and also so the big buys effectively from our side are more in capital markets, they're not in food industry. Yes, my second point is about insetting. You were saying, okay, what about insetting? When we speak with our buyers, we speak to them about insetting, but also offsetting. That needs to be done in parallel, not one and then another, because we don't have time to wait. And effectively for carbon removals, we can speak about offsetting of unabatable emissions, and especially of their scope 3 unabatable emissions. And then it really goes to the industry and how much of these unabatable emissions do they have. Some have none or very, very few, and some have a lot. So I think it's really important to address these industries who have a lot of these unabatable emissions.
A few more questions back here as well.
Hi, good afternoon. Erica Johnson with Agrina. We do regenerative agriculture, finance, and technology, digital MRV. And I have two questions, but I know there's others in the room, so I'll ask both, and if we don't have time, I'll let you keep track of that. First one is, we have EU ETS 1, 2, 3. What now Ag-ETS is on the table? What is the panel's perspective on the necessity of this being a separate ETS versus including it into the existing frameworks, which we already have? And then second question is surrounding fairness and equity. And I think this falls into a lot of the topics which have been discussed today, but also the controversy among farmers, right? And so how do we ensure Denmark is also considering introducing, or is going to be introducing, a carbon tax at the farm level, and this is going to be directly put onto the producers. And if we introduce an ETS, how do we go about ensuring that whether it's the supply chain that's paying for it or the carbon market, that there's fairness and equity that goes across the system, so it's not a top-down on the producers, but also not falling solely on the consumers and creating a fair and equitable system within the Ag-ETS. Thank you.
Unfortunately for me, both of your questions were really interesting, so we're going to do both. For the first one, I don't know anyone on the panel whether the Agri-ETS should be a separate mechanism or included in the current ETS 1 or 2. Any takers?
To be honest, I find it a really difficult question, but I think it makes sense to start with developing an Ag-ETS, because the ag sector, I think, is really different because of all the different players, and also because of what you said. I mean, there are complex value chains behind, and within these value chains you need to create a fair system. The reason why farmers go to the streets in Europe right now is partly because they feel they're in an unfair system, so that's something that needs to be challenged. And I'm not sure if you can do that by incorporating agriculture in the existing ETS. But okay, I mean, this is for me also an open question, so yeah, I'm not sure if that is useful for you. Yeah.
I'll just give you just a different view. I think, yes, it should be in the mainstream ETS. What you want, if you put your trader hat on, is deep liquidity, as deep as it can be, and that will drive best price efficiency, and so you will do that by incorporating it into the mainstream ETS.
I totally agree with Nick. For the liquidity, we really need to integrate it as an asset and look at it as a financial asset for trading on carbon. And actually carbon markets can really evolve compared to capital markets, I should say, in a way of this fairness. And to do that, actually we need to act at different levels. Standard have its responsibility to say what is about fairness, how much you should give, but also to open the markets, not only for primarily market, but also for the secondary market. What about the investments? What about the resale of these credits? And also giving back a share to the farmers from the secondary markets. We should examine this approach. Financial markets can definitely be a huge flow for farmers and additional revenue. But these additional benefits that we can have from carbon markets should be shared with them. And we totally have our responsibility as a standard, but also different actors as well, of course, and project holders as well, I think. In a way, they manage their projects on the ground, right? And how do they share revenue with the farmers?
Thanks, and perhaps some comments on the second question as well, which is, I think, if I understand correctly, about the risk of if we created a system for an agriculture ETS, if the burden is passed not to the large actors in the agriculture sector, but more, the farmers and the consumers ultimately. Do you have any comments on this?
I'll say something about farmers. I'm not a farmer, that's for sure. But we do have to deal with a lot of farmers, and what's quite interesting as a learning experience is they're quite resistant to change, and that's an experience we've had from across South Africa and Australia in very different contexts. But what they primarily want to see is what's good for them, right? So what are they going to? The concept of sort of carbon financing is quite a difficult sell in the agricultural sector, but what you want to demonstrate to them is that you can bring meaningful change very quickly that is going to benefit their farm in some way, shape or form. So and how you finance that, basically. And, you know, there's a lot of technologies out there. If you think about, you know, mitigation, on the mitigation side around feedstocks for cattle or whatever, you know, the farmer isn't interested really in the climate impact of those. They want to know that their cattle are going to be healthy, that they're eating the right nutrients and all that kind of stuff. And if you can prove via these technologies that there is a benefit to doing that, then a farmer will get on board if it affects their bottom line. And if you can then say, okay, there is a carrot in the future that there will be a carbon-related payment, you know, they'll be like, okay, great, that's a nice bonus. But it has to work, you know, interventions have to work for the farmer on day one, basically.
Perhaps one more question before we wrap up. I think back here.
Can we have 2 questions? No. Okay. I'll be very quick. Yeah, I'll try to be very quick. So I noticed a bit of confusion on the title. I mean, I'm a bit confused on the title. So an Agri-ETS, because I noticed there is a lot of reflection on project-based finance, so more on credits and what it seems not to be really a cap-and-trade system as we have in Europe, but more we have talks about voluntary carbon markets and such a thing. So my question is a cap-and-trade system something that can work for agriculture, or should we look more at credit mechanisms such as compliance markets, such as the Article 6 maybe, or something more at the project level, rather than cap-and-trade mechanisms?
Let's go first.
I think it can work, but other instruments can also work. There's also the taxing, as already mentioned, but it can work. I mean, if you have big players, like upstream or downstream of the farmer, you can, of course, make them the obligated party, and you can introduce a cap-and-trade system. If that it's the most successful, I don't know. If that it's most effective, I also don't know. But that is something that we need to find out while discussing it and exploring it with all stakeholders, whether that can work and how comfortable all players in the agricultural value chain feel about that.
From our experience, pre-financing agricultural projects is a good thing, but also we see also some discrepancies here and scandals coming on, and how this, so on revenue sharing, but also on at the end, but also how it is managed and monitored at the end. If the project is led by an investor and not by, for example, a cooperative or by someone present in the country of the project. So it's a really important thing. Then I think this both should work, and I think we should also authorize to have verified carbon credits from the past, but also future carbon credits, and just to pre-finance the operations and to go on, why not on forward market? It's literally the case for commodities trading and agricultural commodities trading on capital markets. We have spot trades and we have forward trades, right? So this can operate on the same way.
I don't have much to say other than the case studies that I presented from South Africa and Australia are, they're not targeted, right? So they're not like I said, they're not agricultural mechanisms. And so the agricultural sector has to compete, in effect, with other industrial sectors for emissions reductions in terms of the incentivization. So I mean, I guess, like, if you really want to target the agricultural sector specifically, then potentially a cap-and-trade system is the way forward. Otherwise, you're on a project-based situation where agriculture kind of has to compete with other sectors, and you're not necessarily looking at a very sector-specific initiative to drive emissions reductions across the board.
I think that was a very great question, actually, to wrap up. It was actually pretty much my last question myself. But I think what I've learned from this session so far is that perhaps when it comes to the question point blank, is an agriculture ETS the correct way forward for the EU to tackle one of the highest emitting sectors in the EU? perhaps we're not quite there yet. We have lots of moving parts when it comes to the carbon removals, certification frameworks, green claims, uses, and trying to figure out how this works when we come to pricing agriculture emissions. But we've seen then also from the various case studies that when it comes to national projects, national agriculture projects at scale, they work. They can work, and they can be certified and verified as well. What this looks like when it comes to pricing agriculture emissions in the EU is very much still a question mark, but I think it's something that we need to keep going, and also to provide more input to the Commission as it discusses whether a legislative proposal for this would be a viable option. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. I thank my panelists very much. They've done an amazing job. And thank you all for attending, and enjoy the sessions today.